Joining me now on the Knicks Film School Podcast. Very, very, very pleased and honored to have this person as a first-time guest. His name has been on more breaking news and rumors reports over the last few years than just about anyone who covers the sport of basketball. We're going to talk to him about some of that. He does all that for Bleacher Report. He also is the author of one of the best NBA books to come out in some time, one of the best sports books to come out in some time, Built to Lose, How the NBA's Tanking Era Changed the League Forever, from Triumph Books. Pleased to be joined by Bleacher Report's Jake Fischer. How you doing, my man?
I'm doing better now that you said I wrote one of the best sports books ever. That's very kind of you to say, man. Thank you.
I mean, I'm biased because if there's someone who takes the time to write a nitty-gritty, like 95% of sports fans might not care about this level of minutia, but the other 5% are going to eat it up. Like, you're writing for me. So again, I'm biased. I can admit that, but it was awesome, man.
Thank you, man. It's got a lot in there that any fan who loves the slop will enjoy. There's front office infighting and trade negotiations and little locker room tiffs and all that type of stuff, from Philly to Boston to Sacramento, some New York, 2015 draft stuff with Porzingis and Phil Jackson. And, it really does kind of have a tentacle into every single team. So if you're out there and you like the NBA and you like original reporting, that's my pitch.
I want to get back to the book a little bit later because I have some questions about not only that, but where kind of tanking is today since you spent some time writing the book. But he mentioned slop. There's been some slop this offseason. Oh boy. And we're still, it seems, in the midst of that slop, perhaps in the middle of it. Let's start with obviously what you're here to, I'm sure what most listeners are going to be most concerned about, which is the Knicks' current situation as far as Donovan Mitchell. You've done a lot of reporting on this. You've done some interviews on it. Is it fair to say at this point we're still at a standstill and that nothing new has emerged over the last few weeks?
Yeah, I had not heard anything new. The only new thing I've heard is that there's nothing new. You know what I mean? So I think I do think that the situation is a bit tied to the Kevin Durant sweepstakes as well. So that's important context. I feel like I might not have illustrated that point enough. They're not, directly connected, but Toronto, for example, is one of the teams that's potentially looming out there that could be a player for both. Miami, I think, is probably more of a player for Donovan than for Kevin Durant. But even then, to bring us back to the Knicks, the Knicks clearly have the best possible package in terms of draft pick capital that the Utah Jazz could command from anybody. They can trade up upwards of 8 first-round picks, right? You guys have talked about this time and again. But that doesn't mean the Knicks want to aggressively outbid other teams if they're distracted by the Kevin Durant situation. If they don't have, Miami only has 2 first-round picks, I believe, to put on the table. So I think it is definitely a bit of a staring contest. And, someone I saw on Twitter, I forget who, so apologize for not giving credit, today joked that maybe there should be an August 15th trade deadline, a second offseason trade deadline before training camp to kind of, that would help things. Because for now, same thing with KD. Any team that wants to go get Donovan, the Knicks included, that haven't necessarily met the Utah Jazz's asking price yet, there's nothing really happening aside from a meeting with Joe Tsai in London, which, I don't know how much that's really going to change things either there. There's got to be some type of tangible event to really have actual movement in these trade talks.
So I think the impression that I know I'm under and that I think a lot of fans are under is the only tangible event that's coming up anytime soon is the opening of training camp. And it feels to me like that's going to be the next instance of, does anybody blink? I understand Danny Ainge puts forth this kind of posture of I'll keep Donovan Mitchell until the end of his contract if I need to. Do you get the sense that there might be some edginess on the part of the Jazz if they're on the eve of camp, and or does that depend on how close the sides are in negotiations at that point?
I don't think so, because I think the situations between Donovan and Kevin are different in this regard. I really do think Utah, and maybe not on the whole, but there are big portions of Utah leadership, from my understanding, that have never wanted to trade Donovan, that don't want to trade Donovan, that have recognized, all right, this Rudy Gobert deal happened. We got put forth an offer from Minnesota that was beyond our wildest dreams of picks and other pieces. Jared Vanderbilt is nothing to sniff at. Patrick Beverley definitely has retrade value. I think Malik Beasley does as well, but to a lesser degree. They got Walker Kessler, a first-round pick in this year's draft. And there's more. So I think that put the question of, do we trade Donovan, at the forefront more so than it would have been if the Rudy Gobert deal didn't happen, because Toronto was on the hook. Chicago was on the hook. Atlanta had, some type of conversation with Utah too. No team came close, from my understanding, to what Minnesota was willing to put on the table to get him. So that changes things drastically. But I still think that, they were looking at some type of sign and trade thing with Colin Sexton to try to add a piece around Donovan Mitchell at a certain point in this offseason. So I really do think Utah would be content bringing him back, especially, clearly it's not that big of a deal now, having the two All-Stars, or having an All-Star when hosting the midseason, event in February, but it wouldn't hurt, right? So, they redo these jerseys. I've been told Donovan had a stamp of approval on those.
Really? So, I don't want him anymore. Now I can't co-sign any trade.
So there's definitely interest in keeping him, versus with Brooklyn. I think the second a team puts together a package that meets the Nets asking price, I think they're going to punch that button and accept it. Yeah.
So you mentioned the Gobert trade, and that, from your understanding, and I think from everything I've certainly read and seen, nobody else came close. I think it's pretty clear the Knicks don't want to be in a situation where a trade goes down and then there's a bunch of reporting afterwards like, wow, nobody was really close to this. And then, on the flip side of it, you have Ainge, who knows very well what the Knicks have and what he is capable of getting. And the fact that, look, we talk about it all the time on the show. I don't need to belabor the point here. The Knicks do need a guy who could do what Donovan Mitchell does on the basketball court. Where I've always come back to, and I want your opinion on this, is that ultimately for Ainge, it's going to come down to the picks, and specifically how many real golden ticket possibility lottery tickets he can get from a team. And that's why when the news broke a month ago, I was like, I think the Knicks have an advantage here, because I think Danny Ainge is going to look at the Knicks and say, I think they have a better chance of stinking in 5, 6, 7 years than the Heat or the Raptors, and I'm a Knicks fan, but I could sit here and I could say that because I think, I'm just trying to peer into what Danny Ainge is thinking. Do you think that there is legitimacy to that? And do you think, if you had to guess right now, or if there isn't maybe something, what do you think these negotiations will ultimately come down to? Will it be those future 28, 29, maybe 27, one of those picks? Or do you think it might come down to a Quentin Grimes or an Obi Toppin or something like that?
I think it's more the latter than the previous. I think it's going to be, and a lot of my job is, or at least my approach to it, is taking recent events and gleaning info from that, and then using that to color the questions I ask moving forward, right? And if you look at the Gobert trade, from everything I heard and what's been reported pretty left and right, the Wolves had to put in more draft capital because they weren't including McDaniels, right?
Okay.
So that type of haggling is what I heard was going on, but right when the Knicks Jazz talks heated up and they were, in conversation, and some people reported it was on the brink of being done. I never heard it was on an, I'm not refuting that.
I was going to ask you about that. What's the deal with where there was that flurry of 4 or 5 days where it seemed like every day there was 2 or 3 different people who were trades. Do you have any idea where all that came from?
I mean, it was they were having, I was told, serious conversations. They were having serious talks, pitching multiple frameworks, different scenarios. And that kind of goes back to what I was going to say, in that if it's Derrick Rose's salary versus Evan Fournier's, for example, like that could be, Utah could look at that one way in terms of value compared to New York. Or if it's, Obi Toppin and, McBride and Grimes versus Obi and Emmanuel Quickly. And, there's going to be a mixing and matching. Every organization pretty typically they will have a ranking of what they think another team's, maybe it's not like a straight spreadsheet ranked 1 through 30, but they will have either an analytical computation. Is that the word?
Sure, that works.
Of what they actually are valuing, like Obi Toppin at, or valuing a 2024 second round pick at, let's say, and they will rank them and they will say, if we're not getting this, then we want that. So that's going to be, and I think that it, from my understanding, was where certain things fell apart, right? Where and most conversations do fall apart, and they can come back. The Boston Brooklyn conversations with Kevin Durant. I keep going back to that, but it just, like, to me, they're very obvious context for each situation. Boston has shown a willingness to include Jaylen Brown. Brooklyn said, great. That's definitely the linchpin we're going to need, but you're going to need a hell of a lot more. Those talks, fall apart, and they're still out there. They can still be, revitalized and get serious, but they fell short with the early New York stuff. There was all these different things. There was, what I was told was there was different negotiations on all the young pieces, and I think RJ Barrett is even in his own category. How much is he worth? One GM I talked to from a different team said, well, if I'm Utah, I don't care if I don't want to pay RJ Barrett. I don't care if I don't think he's someone that I want to rebuild around. He's clearly the best young blue chip asset player that the Knicks have. I just want him back in my return from a sheer value.
Figure it out later.
Anyway, then, I talked to multiple people directly involved in the situation who said Utah doesn't want RJ Barrett. They don't want to deal with paying him. But because he is that value play, maybe him not being in the deal, Utah is trying to spin as, oh, well, that's why you need to give us more picks. Yeah. So it is kind of this convoluted he said, she said type of negotiation, bartering that across the board, from veteran salary that's going to match, and the Derrick Rose, Evan Fournier thing. I don't know for sure if it is that cut and dry. It has sounded like that to me in the past. Being that,
what is that cut and dry? Maybe, that Rose or Fournier would be the main salary going back, or something else?
The Jazz have no interest in long-term money, so Julius Randle's deal seems to be a non-starter. But to that long-term money point, Derrick Rose has only one guaranteed year left. His next year on his deal is a team option. Evan Fournier does have a second year. So that might seem on the surface like not that big of a deal. But
it might be to Utah.
It might be to Utah, especially with retrade value. And Derrick Rose would, in theory, he was a better player last year, right? And he's on a more flexible contract for even the next team after Utah that, in theory, the Jazz would look to move him onto, or Evan Fournier and vice versa. So all those little, pivot points, inflection points of these negotiations really will matter.
One more on this, and then I want to move on to the book. You just described, I think, it again, my own 2 cents, having absolutely no sources on this, why this has the potential to drag out for a very long time, because there are just so many variables about and deal constructions you could have. And then when you have Brock Aller on the other side, who was, the master of pick protections and this and that, it adds another layer of complexity. If you had to guess, again, I'm asking you to guess, I'm going to be very clear. Any aggregators listening, this is just be careful. Do you think it gets done? I'm not even going to ask you to put time on it. Do you think this trade gets done at some point between the Knicks and the Jazz?
I would guess yes.
Okay.
A couple weeks ago, people in the league were talking as if it was a matter of when, not if, it was going to get done. That was before this has dragged out for, it's been over a month, basically. I think I left Vegas on July 12th, and that was the day that I wrote my story about the trade talks. I had gotten wind of the Colin Sexton stuff and was like, okay, I've got some Knicks, whatever. I was ready to write the story. And then I think The Athletic broke that they had to talk. So, it's been a month, right? At that point in time, it was definitely a matter of when, not if. I still would think that looking at the marketplace, like we talked about at the top, the Knicks have the assets to go and get Donovan more than anybody else who would actually be in the running. OKC's not, pushing their chips on the table to go get Donovan Mitchell, right? I don't think New Orleans or Memphis really are either. So it kind of just comes down to the Knicks and some type of acquiescing and a deal to get done for both sides. The one thing that I would say is maybe in the column of pushing this towards not happening, the Knicks are definitely not looking at their overall roster construction as Donovan Mitchell or bust. They looked at Jalen Brunson as being one guy that any number of number one, number two type guys would want to come play with. I mean, it was 6 months ago when everyone was, just pounding the table for Zion going to New York, right? Obviously, he's re-signed with the Pelicans, and that situation seems simpatico for now. But I think a big reason why New York is not just rushing to put 6 first-round picks on the table for Donovan is they're going to want to do more. So they want to maintain more flexibility to continue to add to this team. And I do think there's a price that they're willing to go to, but not over that. I don't know 100% what it is. Certainly sounds less than 5 first-round picks. So, I think it's in that 4 to 5 range, depending on what the collection of the other contracted players are.
Their comfort level as far as picks putting in.
That's how it sounds to me. Yes.
I think you just gave an answer that'll be music to a lot of Knicks fans' ears, because I think that's where the fan base is right now. They don't want to give up the haul, and they don't feel like it should be Donovan Mitchell or bust. Even though there might be another obvious next star, to fit the timeline that is asking out, but this is the NBA, and crazy shit happens, which is a good transition to your book. So, as a matter of context, when did most of the reporting for you occur? Because I feel like that'll help set the stage for what I want to ask about.
I did most of the reporting during the 2018-19 and 19-20 season.
And the focus obviously was on years that preceded that. But so the reporting on the book is like 3-4 years old. In the time, because I feel like when you wrote this and shortly before the book came out, it felt like the league was moving away from tanking. Mm-hmm. And now we're sitting here and I'm looking at next year and I'm like, wow, this is going. I mean, you want to talk about race to the bottom? Teams are they gearing up. Do you what do you think about where the league is right now, having done all this work, talking to all these teams and all these people? Philly's the most famous example, but you obviously reported on other teams as well about their approach. Do you think the league is this is just inevitable? Teams are going to continue to go this route?
Yeah. The 2014 draft was considered to be the draft of all drafts, the first draft loaded with all-stars since 2003. 2003 obviously brought LeBron, Wade, and Bosh. And right around 2012, 2013, 14, they were all playing together in Miami, going to the finals every single year. So all these teams like Boston and Philly and Orlando and Sacramento and Cleveland and Milwaukee for a year and Minnesota, they all said, we're not going to beat LeBron anyway. Let's get the next LeBron. Andrew Wiggins at the time, Jabari Parker, Joel Embiid, Aaron Gordon was a prize in that draft. Marcus Smart, Julius Randle was a prize in that draft. And this year, Scoot Henderson and Victor Wembanyama and the Thompson twins are already considered this top 4 with Wembanyama, I think, in his own category. So I do think part of the tanking trend is directly tied to when there's this expectation of just a generational type of superstar being available. But to your point, the league is kind of in a place right now where you're either tanking or you're doing everything you can to win. Yeah. And it really has eliminated much of the middle ground. Sure, there are teams in there, right? There are teams in the back end of the lottery. There are teams like New Orleans. That's a plucky young team. They make a fun run through the play-in tournament and they try
Jake, I cover one right here in the Knicks. I mean, we could say the quiet part out loud. It's okay.
The Knicks are a mediocre team right now, but the Knicks, for trying to make the playoffs. They go out and get Jalen Brunson trying to get back into the playoffs. Even teams, like Sacramento made a trade for Domantas Sabonis to try to get into the playoff picture. But if you really don't think you're a playoff team, you're tanking. You are bottoming out, and you're trying to become what Cleveland is now, what Memphis is now. And I do think a lot of tanking and trying to rebuild and build something organically with young guys, I do think a lot of that is a counterpunch to the player empowerment era. Because if a team like New Orleans or Memphis or Cleveland or even Golden State back with Steph Curry, and as they've done with that, you can get these guys under team control. You can build around them and grow something with them. It prevents you from being, a flight risk, or you try to prevent yourself from flight risk and not leave yourself at the whim of someone requesting a trade and wanting to get the hell out. If you've already paired them with 2 or 3 all-star caliber players that you got in the draft around them, you try to make it work. But the reason why I want to write the book is it's not so easy. OKC drafted KD, Russ, and Harden and lost all of them. Philly had all these picks and they got Joel Embiid, and Ben Simmons turned into James Harden, but they still haven't gotten out of the second round. It is a challenge. And that alchemy of going from rebuild with a bunch of young dudes to a legitimate contender like Golden State is year after year, it's really, really damn hard. And there's a lot of stories in there to show why it is so challenging.
And some of the stories you tell, and you just mentioned them, are about Philly. And to be clear to everybody, you go through 5 different teams in the book. It's Boston, Orlando, Sacramento, Lakers, and Philly. But I want to key in on the Sixers for a sec, because you had, I'm not going to give them all away because people should go buy the book. But some great anecdotes.
Save a few. There's plenty in there to save.
I mean, the Karolinko stuff was pretty interesting, that he was basically and the way you tell it, he was basically begging to be cut, and eventually the league and you, I think, intimated that the union had to step in to get him eventually bought out from Philly.
Yeah, there was a lot of situations where Hinkie would swing a deal and there was some agreement already made. Okay, well, we'll waive him immediately and he'll become a free agent and what have you. But as the years went on, every time that happened, Brett Brown was begging to get one of these veteran guys. When they traded Evan Turner for Danny Granger, Danny Granger was the superstar of the Indiana Pacers, gets hurt, loses his team to Paul George, comes back, gets traded from this team that was the rival to Miami in the Eastern Conference to Philadelphia, the worst team in the league that wasn't trying to win games. And Brett Brown was begging for him to try to come be a veteran leader. And Danny Granger was no, get the hell out of here. Andre Karolinko's situation was even more convoluted, being that he had a pregnant wife who was bedridden, having a really, really difficult pregnancy. He wasn't going to uproot her from her hospital in New York to go play a couple meaningless games for some young pups down in Philadelphia. So yeah, that was a real, and it went on for months, I remember.
Yeah. And that's just one of the Hinkie things in here. And then ultimately you have, the part where the Okafor stuff happens, and then as you write it, Adam Silver was none too pleased about how things were going on. And then you kind of tell the story about how Colangelo was brought in, that eventually led to Hinkie's ouster. It's interesting because I think a lot of people, when they think about Hinkie, we can finish up with this, his being fired as oh, well, the league stepped in and basically showed that you can't, they're not going to put up with sustained organizational, tanking. And meanwhile, I'm looking at what OKC has done for the last few years, and I'm this is as bad, if not worse, than with SGA, sit out healthy games. The guy's an all-star caliber player. And then then you read the book and it's clear. It's no, it wasn't about the tanking. It was about Hinkie just not being someone that, anybody liked, and that pissed a lot of the wrong people off. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
Yes. And I also think a big difference is the fact that Philadelphia is a major market. They're the 3rd winningest franchise in league history. this was right after the lockout when they instituted this revenue sharing system that, this year, $10 million went to every team that weren't a taxpayer team. The Sixers are supposed to be annually paying into that tax, benefiting all the other owners. Instead, they're the laughing stock of the league when they're visiting on the road. The gate revenue isn't coming for rival owners, rival teams. They're complaining to Adam Silver about it. And on top of that, Hinkie would only speak once or twice a year and never really, revealed too much and held his cards close to the vest. Sam Presti does like a 2.5 hour State of the Union address at the end of every season, and it's an OKC. No one cares what's happening in OKC. I'm sorry to say that to Thunder fans, but the league just...
A lot of Thunder fans that listen to this podcast.
The Thunder just aren't in a position to be a black eye on the NBA. They'd have to do, someone involved with OKC would have to do something so egregious to really get the league's attention to they'd have to have some cheating scandals, some drug things, some, Deshaun Watson level, just abhorrent thing in order for the league to crack down on whatever OKC is doing. They can lose a couple games here and there, especially the dirty secret is the Thunder being bad and collecting all-star caliber guys like Shai Gilgeous-Alexander and Josh Giddey and Chet Holmgren and another top 5 guy to leapfrog them back to the playoff picture, just like they did from 07 to 09 when they got KD, Russ, and Harden. That's going to benefit the league too. So everyone's not necessarily playing within the same rule book.
I think you just kind of answered what's going to be my last question, which is it doesn't seem like there is any impetus to change how teams go about their business, how the lottery is. It feels like everybody's kind of happy with the flattened odds. I mean, unless there's complaints about it that I haven't seen reported, is it fair to say, again, as someone who wrote the definitive book on the tanking, on tanking and how teams went about it, that things are not going to change anytime soon?
So, I mean, the play-in tournament has gotten pretty much universal praise, and that's encouraged a couple teams to not tank and to fight for it, right? Like New Orleans did, like Sacramento at first did, trading for Sabonis, like we talked about. And when the league makes a big change like they did to the lottery reform, I haven't talked about this in a long time. I believe there's been 4 iterations now of the lottery. Once they do that, they're not going to look to change it anytime soon, because then they would admit that their big change didn't work. That's
good call.
That's another thing. They're going to make sure they at least act like it's solved tanking for at least 5 to 10 years. That's definitely going to happen.
Yeah, I guess so. All right, last thing. Not that anyone should need this information, but for anybody who doesn't know, can you let people know where to find you and obviously where to find your book?
You got it, man. The book's available anywhere books are sold. Built to Lose: How the NBA's Tanking Era Changed the League Forever. My Twitter, Jake L. Fischer, Fischer. That's where I post whatever I'm doing when I don't tweet that much. So when I have something, I put something out. That's pretty much it.
There are the list, and again, I have kids and a wife, so this should carry some extra meaning. There is a very, very short list of people that no matter what I'm doing, I could be in the middle of a splash park, like I think I was when the last time you tweeted something along these lines. But when a Jake Fischer tweet drops with an article with new news in it, it's like, honey, I need 10 minutes, and then go digest, read, and then put out whatever I need to put out, because that is the place that you have elevated to in the league. Universally respected, trusted, and that's why I really want to get you on. And thank you for spending a few minutes. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, man. I appreciate the kind words. That is the goal of what we do, right? So thank you so much. It means a lot to get that feedback.
Enjoy the rest of the offseason, my friend.
You got it. Take care, guys.